The heavy scent of antiseptic hung thick in the sterile air, while the monotonous rhythmic chirping of the heart monitor echoed through the recovery room, following my emergency appendectomy. I am Victoria, a 30-year-old architect living in Charleston, and I was still struggling to shake off the lingering haze of anesthesia when my phone began vibrating incessantly on the bedside table. A desperate text message from my younger sister flashed across the screen, claiming her roommate had kicked her out in the middle of the night and she had nowhere else to go. Having dealt with her constant financial irresponsibility and manipulative behavior for years, I typed out a blunt refusal, making it clear that my home was not a revolving door for her self-inflicted crises. I thought that would be the end of it, but the very next morning, before I could even manage to sit up without searing pain, she called me with a terrifyingly cheerful tone that made my blood run cold. She didn't ask for permission again. Instead, she smugly informed me that our parents had already given her their full blessing to move in while I was incapacitated. "I've already hauled all my boxes into your living room, so you don't even have to worry about a thing," she chirped, completely ignoring the fact that she had just violated the only sanctuary I had worked my entire life to build. A wave of absolute fury and helplessness crashed over me as I realized my own family had conspired to strip away my privacy and security at the exact moment I was most vulnerable. Before we dive into how I reclaimed my home from these betrayers, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment of this justice. Sharing your own experiences in the comments helps our community grow, and I would truly love to hear how you would have handled such a blatant violation of trust. I reached out to my parents directly from my hospital bed, hoping for a shred of maternal comfort, but instead I was met with a chilling wave of indifference from the very people who had raised me. My mother, Beverly, answered the phone with a weary sigh that suggested my emergency surgery was somehow a personal inconvenience to her daily schedule. When I demanded to know why my security system was showing unauthorized access, my father, Douglas, chimed in on the speakerphone to admit they had personally handed over my spare keys and property documents to a locksmith. He actually had the nerve to tell me that family must help each other during hard times, as if my hard-earned home was a public shelter for his favorite daughter's failures. Beverly added that they couldn't possibly let Veronica sleep on the streets, while I had an entire house sitting empty during my recovery. Their complete lack of remorse made my stomach churn more than the post-operative nausea ever could, especially when I realized they had effectively handed my life savings over to a person they knew was destructive. The situation escalated quickly when I logged into my banking app and saw a series of pending charges from a high-end furniture gallery in downtown Charleston. Veronica was shamelessly using the supplementary credit card I had provided for emergencies to purchase a luxury velvet sectional sofa for my living room. She wasn't just staying in my house, she was treating my credit limit like a winning lottery ticket to transform my private residence into her personal content studio. I watched through the internal hub of my smart home system as she paraded around my kitchen, filming herself while opening vintage wine bottles that I had been saving for special occasions. Every time she laughed for the camera, I felt another layer of trust in my family disintegrating into nothingness. She was living a champagne lifestyle on my dime, while I was struggling to even walk to the hospital bathroom without assistance. The true extent of her malice became clear when I checked the garage camera and saw my professional life being treated like literal trash. Veronica had hauled every single one of my hand-drawn architectural blueprints and physical models out into the humid, damp garage just to clear space for her wardrobe racks. These were projects that had taken me years to develop now, sitting in a space prone to flooding and mold, just so she could have a better background for her social media videos. I tried calling her to demand she move them back, but she simply blocked my number and continued her broadcast as if I didn't exist. The sheer entitlement required to discard someone's career work in their own home is something I still struggle to wrap my head around. I sat there in that hospital room feeling my pulse quicken, with a mixture of rage and profound sadness at how easily my parents had facilitated this violation. Before I could even process the destruction of my professional work, an urgent email from the Charleston Homeowners Association popped up in my inbox with a formal violation notice. Apparently, my neighbors had reported excessive noise coming from my property until 3 in the morning because Veronica had decided to host a massive housewarming party. The email specifically mentioned several guests seen smoking on my wooden porch, which is a strictly prohibited fire hazard that could lead to massive fines or even legal action against me. The association manager warned that if the rowdy behavior continued, they would involve the city authorities to have the guests forcibly removed from the premises. This house was my sanctuary and my greatest investment yet. Within 48 hours, my sister was turning it into a public nuisance that threatened my standing in the community. I felt a cold realization settle in that if I didn't act decisively, I would lose everything I had spent my entire 20s building. Instead of wasting more energy on fruitless arguments with my parents, I began quietly making phone calls to my bank to secure my financial future. I requested a full transcript of every mortgage payment and property tax bill I had paid since the day I closed on the house to ensure my sole ownership was indisputable. I made sure the bank understood that Beverly and Douglas had no legal authority to grant access to my accounts or my physical property, regardless of their biological relationship to me. Every document I gathered was a brick in the fortress I was building to protect myself from the people I once called family. It was heartbreaking to realize that I had to treat my own parents like hostile intruders, but their actions left me with no other choice if I wanted to survive this betrayal. The paper trail I was creating would soon become the only weapon I had against the collective delusion of my family members. The most painful part of this entire ordeal was the crushing realization that Mom and Dad saw my professional success as nothing more than a resource to be harvested. They didn't view my architectural career as a source of pride. They saw it as a convenient safety net for Veronica's perpetual laziness and lack of direction. I had spent a decade working 80-hour weeks to afford a home in one of the most expensive parts of South Carolina, just so they could hand it over to her like a toy. Their belief that I should simply absorb the cost of her lifestyle because I was the stable one was a slap in the face to every sacrifice I had ever made. I looked at the hospital ceiling, realizing that the blood bond I had cherished was actually a chain used to drag me down. My trust was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating determination to ensure that every cent they had stolen from me would be accounted for, in the end. 1 week after completing all the discharge procedures with my surgical stitches still throbbing painfully, I stood motionless before the front door of my own home. My best friend Caleb had insisted on driving me back from the hospital in Charleston carrying my small overnight bag while offering a steady arm for me to lean on. As I reached out to punch my habitual security code into the electronic keypad, a jarring red light flashed, followed by a harsh, unfamiliar beep. I tried the sequence again, thinking my brain was simply foggy from the pain medication, but the result remained the same. Caleb stepped forward to examine the lock, his face darkening when he realized the entire digital interface had been reprogrammed from the inside. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest because I was standing on my own porch, yet I was effectively a stranger to my own property. The silence of the afternoon was suddenly shattered when a blast of heavy bass music erupted from within the house, vibrating the very floorboards beneath my feet. I hammered my fist against the solid oak door, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain in my abdomen, but the only response was the volume of the music increasing to a deafening roar. Seconds later, the upstairs window creaked open, and Veronica leaned out with a smirk that radiated pure, unadulterated malice. She didn't offer an explanation or an apology. Instead, she looked down at me as if I were a persistent solicitor bothering her on a private estate. Our parents gave me the right to be here, so you should just go find yourself a hotel, she shrieked over the thumping rhythm, her voice dripping with a sense of entitlement that made my blood boil. Before I could even find the breath to scream back, she slammed the window shut and pulled the heavy curtains closed, leaving me trembling in the humid South Carolina heat. Caleb gently guided me back toward his car, sensing that my physical strength was rapidly failing even as my anger reached a breaking point. I sat in the passenger seat with the door open, forced to watch in stunned silence, as a group of disreputable-looking strangers pulled into my driveway. They climbed out of a battered sedan carrying crates of cheap beer and clinking bottles of hard liquor while laughing loudly as they walked toward my front entrance. One of them actually had the audacity to wink at me before he used my spare key, to walk right into my foyer. These people looked like they had never held a steady job in their lives, yet they were being given free rein of the home I had spent a decade of 80-hour work weeks to afford. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my surgery, as I watched my sanctuary being turned into a common party house for criminals. The wind shifted slightly, bringing with it a thick, pungent stench of cigarette smoke and cheap marijuana wafting out from the gaps in my doorway. My heart sank, because I had spent thousands of dollars and countless hours restoring the original crown molding and antique flooring of this historic Charleston residence. Smoke damage is notoriously difficult to remove from old wood, and the thought of my vintage rugs being burned by careless ash felt like a personal violation of my soul. I could see the flickering glow of party lights through the cracks in the blinds, a visual confirmation that the elegant home I had curated was being systematically dismantled. Every muffled shout of laughter from inside felt like a jagged blade twisting in my recent surgical wound, reminding me of how little my comfort mattered to my own flesh and blood. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat and turned on the air conditioning, looking at me with a mixture of pity and fierce protective instinct. He reached over to close my door, blocking out the sight of another stranger stumbling onto my porch with a lit cigarette in hand. "Victoria, you are in no condition to fight a house full of drunks right now, so let's get you somewhere safe," he said firmly while already pulling up a list of nearby boutique hotels on his phone. I wanted to protest, to stay and fight until my stitches tore open, but the exhaustion was beginning to cloud my vision, and my legs felt like lead. He was right, of course, because an emotional confrontation in my current state would only end with me back in the emergency room, while Veronica laughed at my weakness. We sat there for a moment in the sanctuary of his quiet car, watching the house I loved become a den of chaos under the direction of my younger sister. The drive to the hotel was a blur of neon lights and repressed tears, as the sheer humiliation of my situation finally began to sink in. I was a successful architect with a prestigious firm, yet I was being forced to use my own credit card to book a room at the French Quarter Inn because I had been evicted by a squatter. Paying nearly $400 for a single night of sleep felt like an additional tax on my misery, while my sister lived for free in my master suite. I sat on the edge of the plush hotel bed, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror and feeling like a ghost in my own life. My parents were likely at home right now, blissfully unaware or intentionally ignoring the fact that their eldest daughter was effectively homeless. The bitter irony of the situation was that the more I succeeded, the more my family felt entitled to take, leaving me with nothing but a hotel receipt and a mounting desire for cold, calculated justice. Exactly at 8 o'clock the following morning, I returned to my front porch, accompanied by a priority locksmith and a professional heavy-duty cleaning crew I had secured through an emergency service. I had spent the early dawn hours sitting in my car a few blocks away, watching through my phone, as Veronica finally emerged from the house and climbed into an Uber, likely headed to her regular morning salon appointment. The moment her vehicle disappeared around the corner, I signaled the locksmith to begin his work on the electronic deadbolt that had kept me barred from my own life just a day prior. I didn't feel any hesitation or guilt as the metal grinding against metal echoed through the quiet street, because this was no longer about family, It was about the absolute restoration of my boundaries. Within 10 minutes, the fraudulent lock was bypassed, and I immediately instructed the technician to install the most advanced facial recognition security system available on the market to ensure this would never happen again. As soon as the front door swung open, the stench of stale alcohol and cheap cigarettes hit me like a physical wall, confirming my worst fears about the state of my interior. I waved the professional cleaning crew inside, giving them strict instructions to treat every item belonging to my sister as literal refuse that needed to be cleared immediately. They worked with a terrifyingly efficient speed, sweeping through the guest room and the master suite to gather every scrap of Veronica's fast fashion clothing and overpriced makeup into oversized cardboard cartons. Every sequined dress and half-empty bottle of designer perfume was tossed into the boxes without the slightest regard for their supposed value or fragility. I stood in the center of the foyer, ignoring the lingering ache in my surgical incision as I watched her entire life being compressed into a dozen anonymous brown boxes in under 30 minutes. Once the house was cleared of her physical presence, I personally oversaw the loading of every single carton into the back of a rented moving truck I had parked at the curb. I climbed into the driver's seat, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction as I began the 50-mile journey toward a large homeless shelter located on the far outskirts of Charleston. I wasn't going to leave these things on the sidewalk where she could simply reclaim them. Instead, I wanted them to be put to use by people who actually appreciated the value of a roof over their heads. When I arrived at the donation center, the staff looked surprised by the sheer volume of high-end goods, but I simply told them I was clearing out a life I no longer wished to lead. I drove back toward the city, feeling lighter than I had in years, knowing that by the time Veronica realized her wardrobe was gone, it would already be in the hands of people she had spent her life looking down upon. While the cleaning crew continued their deep scrub of the floors and walls, I spent the afternoon strategically installing 4 high-definition hidden cameras in the shadowed corners of the porch and entryway. I linked each device to a specialized security application that would send an instantaneous silent alarm to the local police department the moment an unauthorized face was detected on the property. I also took the liberty of changing the Wi-Fi credentials and disabling every smart device that my parents might have had secondary access to through their shared accounts. I am reclaiming every single inch of this property, and I will not leave a single loophole for them to exploit. I whispered to myself as I finalized the encryption settings on the new hub. The house was slowly beginning to feel like my own sanctuary again, though the invisible scars of the betrayal still lingered in the air like a bitter aftertaste. The cleaners eventually pointed out a massive, ugly cigarette burn in the center of my hand-woven Persian rug, a piece that I had saved for 6 months to purchase during my first year as an architect. Instead of trying to salvage the ruined fabric, I told them to roll it up and throw it into the dumpster along with the mountain of trash Veronica's friends had left behind. I authorized an additional $500 for a specialized industrial-grade ozone treatment to neutralize the lingering smell of smoke that had permeated my expensive silk curtains and velvet upholstery. Watching the heavy machinery whir to life felt like a spiritual cleansing, a necessary process to remove the toxic energy that had occupied these rooms during my hospital stay. I wasn't just cleaning a house, I was erasing the very evidence that my sister had ever set foot across my threshold after her blatant act of treachery. By late afternoon, the house was silent, smelling of citrus and expensive polish rather than the filth and chaos of the previous week. I sent the cleaning crew home with a generous tip and locked the new facial recognition deadbolt, hearing the heavy mechanism click into place with a finality that brought a cold smile to my lips. I took a seat in my favorite leather armchair in the now empty living room, holding my original property deed and the newly printed security protocols firmly in my lap. I knew it was only a matter of time before Veronica returned from her day of pampering to find herself a ghost in the home she thought she had conquered. Let her come back and try her luck now. She's about to find out exactly what happens when you steal from a woman who has nothing left to lose. I thought as I watched the sun begin to set over the Charleston skyline. Only 15 minutes after Veronica returned and realized her door code was no longer functioning, the sound of hysterical screaming began to echo down the length of the quiet Charleston street. I stood behind the reinforced glass of my front door, watching through the high-definition monitor as she hammered her manicured fists against the solid oak until her knuckles must have been bruised. She was shrieking into her phone, her voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and genuine panic as she wailed to our mother about being locked out like a common criminal. I could hear her frantic cries through the thick wood claiming that I had committed a federal crime by disposing of her supposedly priceless wardrobe and throwing her out into the humid afternoon air without warning. She looked utterly disheveled compared to her usual polished social media persona, a sight that gave me a grim sense of satisfaction considering the pain she had caused me just days prior. The situation escalated within minutes when my parents' luxury SUV screeched to a halt at the curb and Beverly and Douglas tumbled out with expressions of pure, unadulterated outrage. They didn't even bother to check on my health or ask how my recovery was progressing. Instead, they rushed toward the porch to join Veronica in her assault on my front entrance. Beverly began screaming at the top of her lungs that I was a cold-blooded monster who had betrayed the very core values of our Charleston heritage and family loyalty. Douglas was right behind her, red-faced and shaking his fist at my security cameras, while shouting that I was an ungrateful daughter who deserved to be shamed in front of the entire community. Victoria, open this door right now and let your sister back into this house before you permanently ruin your reputation with this family. My father roared, his voice booming across the neighbors' manicured lawns. The neighborhood silence was soon replaced by the rhythmic strobing of blue and red lights as two Charleston Police Department cruisers pulled up, having been alerted by my automated security system's silent alarm. I finally opened the door, stepping out onto the porch with a calm, methodical composure that seemed to infuriate my family even further. The lead officer approached the scene with his hand resting near his belt, demanding to know who the legal owner of the property was, amidst the chaotic shouting of my relatives. Veronica tried to throw herself toward the officer, sobbing about how I had stolen her life and kidnapped her belongings, while Beverly kept insisting that they had given her full permission to occupy the residence. I stood my ground, feeling the sharp twinge in my side as a reminder of the surgery I was still supposed to be recovering from while they treated me like the intruder. I didn't waste my breath engaging in a screaming match with people who were clearly blinded by their own entitlement and bias toward their favorite child. Instead, I handed the officer a neatly organized folder containing my original property deed, the most recent mortgage statement, and a certified copy of the house title. I pointed out that my parents' names appeared nowhere on these legal documents, and that they possessed absolutely no authority to grant residency to anyone regardless of our biological connection. The officer meticulously reviewed the paperwork, his professional expression shifting as he realized that my family was essentially attempting to authorize a squatter to occupy a private home. Sir, as you can see, I am the sole owner of this property, and these individuals are currently trespassing on my land without a valid lease or my consent. I stated firmly, ensuring my voice was loud enough for my parents to hear every syllable. The atmosphere shifted instantly as the officers turned toward Beverly, Douglas, and Veronica, informing them that their presence on my porch was now a matter of criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct. My mother tried to argue that a daughter couldn't possibly trespass on her own family, but the officer shut her down with a stern warning about the realities of South Carolina property law. He made it very clear that if they did not vacate the premises immediately, he would have no choice but to place them under arrest for disrupting the peace of the neighborhood. Veronica looked absolutely stunned as she realized her tears were no longer working on an audience that valued legal facts over her dramatic performances and emotional manipulation. They were forced to retreat toward the sidewalk, their faces twisted in a mixture of embarrassment and lingering fury as the neighbors watched from their porches. As they stood at the edge of my lawn, still hurling silent glares and muttered insults, I stepped forward to the very edge of the stairs and looked directly at my sister. I didn't care about the onlookers or the police officers. I only cared about ensuring that she understood the absolute finality of the bridge she had burned between us. You have exactly 5 minutes to get into that car and get out of here before I officially request that the police handcuff you for illegal entry, I declared, with a chilling calmness that seemed to silence even my mother's lingering protests. The officers stood behind me as a silent wall of authority, confirming that my threat was backed by the full power of the law and that I was no longer the pushover they had spent decades exploiting. I watched as they finally climbed back into their vehicle, their departure marking the end of the first battle, but the beginning of a war that would change our family forever. 1 week after that chaotic afternoon on my front porch, I sat in the plush leather chair of my lawyer Marcus's office to permanently sever every final obligation binding me to my family. The silence in the high-rise conference room was a stark contrast to the venomous text messages that had been flooding my phone screen for the past 7 days without ceasing. My mother, Beverly, had decided to play her final emotional card by sending me a lengthy, blistering message claiming she was officially removing me from her will and disowning me as a daughter. She wrote that I was dead to them for humiliating Veronica in front of the neighbors, but her threats felt incredibly hollow, considering I was the one subsidizing their entire lifestyle. I handed the phone to Marcus so he could document the harassment, feeling a strange sense of relief that they had finally admitted they valued their pride more than our relationship. The inheritance she was threatening to withhold was likely non-existent anyway, since they had spent years draining their assets to support Veronica's delusions of grandeur. I took a deep breath and instructed Marcus to immediately draft the paperwork for the repossession of the luxury SUV that my parents had been driving for the past 3 years. I had been making every single monthly payment under my name to help them maintain appearances at their country club, but that generosity had clearly been taken for granted. It was a difficult decision to strip my elderly parents of their primary transportation, yet I knew that allowing them to keep the vehicle would only enable their delusion that they could abuse me without consequences. Marcus nodded with professional understanding as he noted the account details, assuring me that the bank would handle the recovery of the vehicle within 48 hours. I could already imagine the shock on Douglas's face when the tow truck arrived to take away the symbol of status he had done absolutely nothing to earn. Next, we moved on to the tangible damages caused by Veronica's unauthorized occupation of my home during my hospitalization, a bill that was growing larger by the day. I provided Marcus with the itemized receipts for the professional cleaning service, the industrial ozone treatment, and the replacement value of the ruined Persian rug. He began drafting a formal demand letter requiring Veronica to pay $5,000 in restitution within 30 days or face a civil lawsuit for property destruction and theft of services. I knew she didn't have a dime to her name because she refused to work, which meant my parents would likely have to drain their own dwindling savings to bail her out once again. This was not just about the money, it was about forcing the golden child to finally see a bill with her own name on it for the first time in her life. The final and most significant step was the closure of the joint bank account that I had established years ago to automatically pay for their health insurance and utility bills. For a decade, I had silently ensured that the lights stayed on in their house and that their medical needs were covered, never asking for a thank you or a repayment. I pulled out my laptop right there in the office and transferred the remaining balance to my personal savings, effectively cutting off the financial lifeline that had kept them afloat. The moment I clicked the confirmation button, I felt a heavy weight lift off my chest because I was no longer funding the very people who had conspired to rob me while I was on a surgical table. It was a terrifying move to make, but I realized that my financial support was the only thing giving them the energy to attack me. As if sensing the seismic shift in the universe, my phone rang almost immediately with my father's name flashing urgently across the screen. I put the call on speakerphone so Marcus could witness the interaction, my hand trembling slightly as I pressed the green answer button to face the music. Douglas didn't even bother to say hello. He immediately began screaming about how the electric company had just notified them of a payment failure and how I was trying to kill them. He called me every name in the book, accusing me of abandoning my own flesh and blood over a simple misunderstanding about a house key. I waited for him to pause for a breath, listening to the man who was supposed to protect me spew hatred because his free ride had ended. I leaned toward the phone and delivered the only words I had left for him. You and Mom sold me out first, so do not dare speak to me about loyalty right now. I hung up the phone before he could respond, ending the conversation and effectively terminating my relationship with the man who raised me. Marcus looked at me with sympathy, but I sat up straighter in the chair, realizing that financial independence was the only shield I had against their toxicity. I walked out of that office into the bright Charleston sunlight, knowing that while I had lost a family, I had finally regained my freedom. The pain of the severance was sharp and deep, but it was far better than the slow death of being used by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. 3 months later, the news regarding Veronica's inevitable downfall began appearing on local judicial news websites, like a destiny that had been foretold by the universe itself. The series of unfortunate events started when my sister simply could not accept the reality that her designer wardrobe was gone forever. Instead of moving on or finding a job to replace her belongings, she made the catastrophic decision to drive out to the homeless shelter where I had donated her things. She arrived in the middle of the night with a pair of bolt cutters, intending to break into their storage warehouse to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. However, she was completely unaware that the items had already been auctioned off weeks ago to raise money for the facility's food program. Her clumsy attempt to force open the warehouse door triggered a silent alarm that brought the county sheriff deputies swarming to the location within minutes. She was arrested on the spot, caught red-handed with burglary tools and a sense of entitlement that evidently did not grant her immunity from the law. Because I had previously filed a formal police report regarding her trespassing on my property, the legal system did not view this new incident as a first-time mistake. The district attorney saw a clear pattern of criminal behavior involving property invasion and disregard for boundaries, which escalated the severity of her charges significantly. During the trial, the judge listened to her tearful excuses about how she was the victim of a vindictive sister, but he remained completely unimpressed by her lack of accountability. He declared that society needed to be protected from individuals who believed they could take whatever they wanted simply because they felt they deserved it. Consequently, the gavel came down with a thunderous finality as he sentenced Veronica to 6 months in a county detention center for attempted burglary and habitual trespassing. It was a humiliating blow for a girl who had spent her entire life believing she was too special to ever face real consequences. While Veronica was being processed into the correction system, my lawyer Marcus reached out to give me an update on the financial ruin that was consuming her life on the outside. He informed me that her credit score had completely plummeted to rock bottom because she had defaulted on every single credit card she owned after I cut off the family cash flow. The thousands of dollars she had charged for that velvet sofa and her other luxuries were now delinquent debts that were accruing massive interest daily. Marcus explained that with a criminal record for burglary and a destroyed credit history, Veronica would effectively be blacklisted by every reputable landlord in the state of South Carolina. She had made herself legally impossible to house, so even after her jail sentence ended, she'd have nowhere to go except the streets or a shelter like the one she tried to steal from. The financial contagion of her mistakes inevitably spread to my parents, forcing them to face the harsh reality of their own enabling behavior. Without my monthly contributions to pay their bills, they quickly realized they could not afford the legal fees required to defend their daughter in criminal court. In a desperate attempt to save Veronica from prison, they were forced to put their beloved countryside vacation home on the market for a quick cash sale. This property had been their pride and joy for decades, a symbol of the status they desperately tried to project to their friends at the country club. Selling it at a loss to pay a defense attorney who ultimately lost the case was a poetic tragedy that left them financially crippled and living in a small rented apartment. They had sacrificed their own retirement security to bail out a sinking ship, and now they were drowning right alongside her. To make matters worse for the family reputation, the video of our confrontation on my porch had somehow found its way onto local social media pages. One of my neighbors had filmed Veronica screaming that our parents gave her permission to invade my home, and the internet community was absolutely merciless in their ridicule. The comment sections were filled with strangers mocking her entitlement and criticizing my parents for raising such a delusional adult who couldn't function in the real world. Her so-called friends, the ones who had partied in my house and trashed my living room, immediately distanced themselves to avoid being associated with a convicted criminal. She was not only broke and incarcerated, but also a social pariah who had been publicly shamed by the very community she tried so hard to impress. The final crushing moment came just before the bailiffs led Veronica away to begin serving her 6-month sentence. She looked back at Beverly and Douglas, who were weeping in the gallery, but there was no love in her eyes, only a cold realization of who was truly to blame. She stopped for a brief second, ignoring her lawyer's instructions to keep moving, and delivered a parting shot that silenced the entire courtroom. "The way you two spoiled me was actually a death sentence for my future, and I hope you are happy with what you created." My parents stood there in stunned silence as their golden child was marched out the side door, leaving them with nothing but their regrets and the wreckage of a family they had destroyed with their own hands. 6 months since the day I left the hospital with a broken heart, I stood in the middle of the empty living room ready for a fresh start. The historic Charleston house that I had once meticulously restored was now completely bare, stripping away the painful memories of betrayal that had stained its beautiful architecture. I had made the difficult decision to sell the property to a lovely young couple because I realized that I could never truly feel safe within these walls again after what my family had done. As I handed over the keys to the real estate agent, I felt a profound sense of relief washing over me, knowing that I was leaving behind not just a building, but an entire lifetime of toxic expectations. I had already purchased a modern condo in Seattle, Washington, placing thousands of miles of physical distance between myself and the people who had treated me like a disposable resource. Before boarding my one-way flight to the Pacific Northwest, I took the final step of completely erasing my digital footprint to ensure they could never find me again. I changed my phone number, deleted my old email accounts, and set up entirely new social media profiles under a pseudonym that only my lawyer Marcus and my best friend Caleb would ever know. It was a drastic measure to take against one's own flesh and blood, but I knew that my parents would eventually try to crawl back into my life the moment their money ran out. I was determined to build a circle of people who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide for them financially. For the first time in my adult life, I was heading toward a future where my hard-earned salary would be spent solely on my own happiness and security. Through the updates provided by Marcus, I learned that Veronica was currently living a nightmare that was essentially the complete opposite of the glamorous life she had tried to steal from me. After being released from the county detention center, she was forced to move into a dilapidated studio apartment in a rough part of town because no decent landlord would accept her application. She was currently working long shifts at a humid logistics warehouse, scanning packages and lifting heavy boxes for minimum wage to make the court-ordered restitution payments she owed me. It was a poetic justice to know that the girl who refused to work and mocked my career was now sweating in a uniform under strict supervision just to survive. She was living under the constant scrutiny of a probation officer who had zero tolerance for her entitlement, forcing her to finally learn the discipline she had lacked since childhood. My parents were arguably suffering an even worse fate because they had to live with the crushing knowledge that they had engineered their own misery. They were now residing in a cramped rental unit, isolated from their social circle and cut off from the daughter who had once been their retirement plan. I imagined the silence at their dinner table, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air that they had sacrificed their successful child to protect a criminal who ultimately failed them anyway. They had gambled everything on the golden child only to find themselves holding a losing hand when the game was finally over. Their regret was not something I needed to hear personally, because their absence from my life was the only apology I would ever accept. Looking back on this harrowing experience, I realize that the most important lesson is that setting boundaries with family is not an act of cruelty, but an act of necessary self-preservation. We are often conditioned by society to believe that we must endure abuse and disrespect simply because we share DNA with the perpetrators, but that is a dangerous lie that keeps us trapped in cycles of pain. I learned that true family is defined by loyalty, respect, and mutual support, rather than just a shared last name or biological history. Another critical takeaway is that financial independence is the strongest shield a woman can have against manipulation, as my ability to hire lawyers and control my assets was the only thing that saved me. Finally, I understood that enabling toxic behavior is just as destructive as the behavior itself, and by refusing to be a safety net for my sister, I actually forced her to face reality for the first time. Thank you so much to everyone who has followed my journey from that hospital bed to my new life of freedom in Seattle. I truly appreciate every single one of you for listening to my story, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how you handle toxic family members. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and resilience.